Before we dive in, viewer discretion is advised. This content is for entertainment purposes.
What happens when a Hollywood darling, known for her poise, elegance, and sharp wit, is suddenly pitted against a daytime television icon, a legend whose voice carries weight in every corner of the entertainment world? What happens when Anne Hathaway, the Academy Award-winning actress, goes toe-to-toe with Whoopi Goldberg, live on The View, with millions of eyes watching and no script to soften the blows? This wasn't a scene from a movie. This was real, unfolding in front of a stunned studio audience and a nation that would soon be buzzing about every word, every gesture, every silence that felt like thunder. Don't forget to like this video and drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear every side of your perspective. The morning began like any other episode of The View. Bright lights, chatter among the audience, the hum of anticipation as producers whispered last-minute cues. And Hathaway, dressed in a tailored cream suit that reflected both power and grace, stepped onto the stage with that signature smile. It was the kind of entrance that commanded attention without demanding it. The crowd erupted in applause. Whoopi Goldberg, seated at the center of the table, leaned back in her chair with that familiar air of control. She was the queen of the panel, the matriarch of the conversation. The two women greeted each other with polite nods, but there was a subtle tension that no one could quite place. A flicker, a glance, the kind of energy that says, something is about to happen. At first, the discussion was cordial. They talked about Anne's latest film, a project layered with complexity, tackling themes of identity and resilience. The other hosts chimed in, praising her performance, marveling at her career longevity. Joy Behar cracked a joke, Sunny Hostin highlighted the cultural relevance, and the atmosphere seemed light-hearted enough. But then Whoopi shifted in her chair. Her tone hardened, her gaze sharpened. "Anne," she began, drawing out the actress's name as though preparing for a confrontation. "You've been very vocal lately about Hollywood's treatment of women, about fairness and representation. But don't you think sometimes actors complain a little too much, considering how privileged this business really is?" The air thickened instantly. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some leaned forward, hungry for what they sensed was coming. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they were about to witness a debate or a disaster. And didn't flinch. Her smile faded, but her eyes held steady, clear, unyielding. "With respect, Whoopi," she replied, her voice even but laced with intensity, "I think it's dangerous to dismiss people's experiences as complaints. Yes, this industry is privileged, but that doesn't mean it's exempt from accountability. And when marginalized people, speak up about injustices, silencing them by calling it complaining only reinforces the problem." A murmur swept the room. The clash had begun. Whoopi raised an eyebrow, her trademark look of skepticism cutting through the studio lights. "But don't you think," she pressed, "that part of being in Hollywood is understanding the game? You don't walk into this business blind. Everyone knows what it is. You play the hand you're dealt." And leaned forward slightly, her hands resting calmly on the table, but there was fire in her delivery. "And what if the game is rigged, Whoopi? What if the hand you're dealt is designed to keep you silent, small, replaceable? Are we supposed to just accept that? Or do we challenge it, even if it makes people uncomfortable?" The audience broke into applause, thunderous, immediate, instinctual. It wasn't just support, it was a release, as if they had been waiting for someone to voice what and had just unleashed. Whoopi's lips curled into a tight smile. "Uncomfortable isn't always bad," she countered, her tone slow, deliberate. "But you gotta be careful, Anne. Sometimes when you push too hard, you lose sight of reality. The struggle is real, but so is the success. You can't have one without the other." And tilted her head, her eyes never leaving Whoopi's. "Maybe. But if success requires silence in the face of injustice, then maybe it's not success at all. Maybe it's just survival." The audience gasped again, louder this time. The tension was no longer subtle. It was electric, sparking between them, filling every corner of the studio. Joy Behar shifted in her seat, looking back and forth like a spectator caught in the middle of a heavyweight match. Sunny Hostin nodded quietly, almost approvingly, while Sarah Haynes clasped her hands, unsure whether to intervene. And then silence. Heavy, deafening silence. Whoopi sat back, eyes narrowed, lips pursed, as if deciding whether to strike harder or retreat gracefully. The cameras caught every flicker of expression, every heartbeat stretched into eternity. And Hathaway didn't back down. Not for a second. The audience roared, breaking the silence with a wave of applause and cheers that shook the studio walls. Some were on their feet, Others clapped cautiously, their eyes darting to Whoopi, unsure of how far this would go. The clash was no longer about Hollywood. It was about power, about truth, about the unspoken rules of silence that Anne had just dared to shatter, live, with Whoopi Goldberg across the table. And this was only the beginning. The applause was still echoing in the studio when Whoopi leaned forward, her elbows planted on the table, her voice dropping lower, edged with steel. "So let me ask you this, Anne," she said, deliberately slow, her words hanging heavy in the air. "If the system is so broken, why are you here? Why are you sitting on this stage, enjoying the perks of fame, the spotlight, the millions of dollars? Isn't there a contradiction in calling out the hand that feeds you?" The audience quieted instantly. A few audible gasps, and didn't move right away. She sat with the stillness of someone who refused to be rattled, someone preparing her response like a blade being sharpened. Her eyes never wavered. "Because I refuse to be complicit," she said finally, her tone sharp but unwavering. "I'm not going to smile and say thank you for crumbs when there are entire loaves being hoarded out of sight. I don't see that as hypocrisy. I see that as responsibility." The crowd erupted, louder than before, and even the cameras shook slightly with the force of the applause. Viewers at home would later describe it as the moment the energy shifted, when Anne's words carried the kind of gravity that couldn't be brushed aside. Whoopi held her ground. "Responsibility is fine," she replied, her voice rising just enough to command silence. "But this constant outrage, this constant attack on Hollywood, on the industry, sometimes it feels less like responsibility and more like grandstanding." Anne's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "Grandstanding? Or standing up? There's a difference, Whoopi. And if people confuse the two, maybe that says more about them than it does about me." The studio gasped again. Even Joy Behar's eyes widened, and she quickly leaned back, as though retreating from the line of fire. Sunny Hostin placed a hand over her mouth, hiding either a smile or shock. It was impossible to tell. Sarah Haynes fidgeted with her note cards, glancing at the producers offstage, as though silently asking if she should cut to commercial. But the producers weren't about to interrupt. This was television gold. The audience was leaning forward now, every head turned toward the two women locked in verbal combat. It was no longer an interview. It was a duel. And continued, her voice steady, almost surgical in its precision. "You've been in this industry longer than me, Whoopi. You've seen it change. You've seen the battles women have fought just to be taken seriously. Don't you think it's our duty, yours, mine, all of ours, not to let complacency undo the progress that's been made?" Whoopi's eyes narrowed. "And don't you think," she shot back, "that sometimes you kids, you newer voices, forget that progress didn't happen overnight? That it was built step by step, sometimes quietly, sometimes painfully? You walk into the room now and demand it all at once. That's not how it works." Anne's reply was instant. "Respectfully, that's exactly the problem. If we keep saying that's not how it works, then it never changes. That's the trap. That's how silence becomes tradition." The audience exploded into applause, some people even shouting out in agreement. "That's right," a woman's voice cried from the back. Whoopi turned her head slightly toward the crowd, her expression betraying the slightest flicker of frustration. She wasn't used to losing the room. For decades, she had been the voice audiences trusted, the anchor in debates. But here, tonight, Anne Hathaway was commanding the tide. Joy Behar tried to break the tension with a quip. "Well, I'll tell you this. If we ever run out of electricity, we could power the whole of New York with the sparks flying at this table." The audience laughed, grateful for the brief release of tension. Even cracked the smallest smile, though her eyes remained locked on Whoopi. But Whoopi didn't laugh. Her gaze was unrelenting, her silence deliberate. When she finally spoke, her words were sharp, almost cutting. "And, you talk a good game. But let me ask you, what happens when you're no longer the hot name? When Hollywood isn't giving you scripts? When the offers dry up? Do you think this industry will reward you for biting the hand that feeds it?" The question lingered in the air like smoke, curling into every corner of the room. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned even further forward, desperate to hear the actress's response. Anne inhaled slowly, then leaned closer to the table, her voice lowering to a near whisper, but one that carried like thunder through the silent room. "If that day comes, Whoopi, then at least I'll know I didn't waste my time protecting a system that harms the very people it pretends to celebrate. If I lose it all because I refuse to stay quiet, then I'll wear that loss like a crown." The crowd erupted. This wasn't polite applause anymore. It was a wave of noise, a standing ovation from pockets of the audience who couldn't hold back their support. Cheers, whistles, the thundering clap of hands against hands. The cameras caught faces in the crowd, tears, nods, wide eyes, disbelief. Even the other hosts looked shaken. Joy blinked, her usual humor silenced. Sunny leaned in, almost whispering. That was powerful. Sarah pressed her lips together, visibly torn between awe and discomfort. Whoopi sat still, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed on Anne as though measuring her, testing her, deciding whether to deliver one last blow or to retreat into silence. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. The studio was alive, buzzing, vibrating with the intensity of what had just been said. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was a reckoning. And in that moment, it became clear. The fight wasn't about Hollywood. It wasn't about privilege. It wasn't even about responsibility. It was about legacy. One woman determined to hold on to it. Another determined to redefine it. The cameras zoomed in, catching the fire in Anne's eyes, the steel in Whoopi's stare. The duel wasn't over. It was only deepening. And no one in that room, not the hosts, not the producers, not the audience, knew just how far it would go before the day was done. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. The air in the studio was heavy, each breath drawn as though the audience was collectively bracing for the fall. And Hathaway sat tall, unshaken, her eyes glowing with conviction. Whoopi Goldberg, still as stone, leaned back in her chair, her expression a fortress of control. But behind her eyes, something flickered. Then Whoopi leaned forward again, her hands clasped tightly together on the desk, her voice sharpened like a blade. You talk about legacy, Anne. You talk about crowns and sacrifices. But let me tell you something. You don't get to rewrite the rules of an industry overnight. You don't get to come in here and tell people who've been fighting for decades that their way wasn't enough. That's arrogance. The words landed like thunder, reverberating through the set. Some in the audience gasped. Others clapped, rallying behind Whoopi's authority. She was, after all, the legend, the EGOT winner, the woman who had blazed her own trail long before Anne Hathaway was a household name. And inhaled, slow and deliberate, but when she spoke, her voice cut through the room like a clear note-piercing fog. It's not arrogance to want better. It's not arrogance to say the fight isn't finished. Whoopi, your generation broke doors open. I honor that. But my generation is walking through those doors, and what we see on the other side is that there are still chains. Different ones may be hidden better, but they're there. And we're not going to pretend they don't exist. The audience erupted again. Cheers, applause, some even stomping their feet against the risers. The sound was visceral, primal, the collective roar of people responding not just to words, but to truth spoken aloud. Whoopi's jaw tightened. Her hand tapped against the desk, slow, measured, as if trying to hold her composure against the swell of energy building around her. Young people always think they've invented struggle, she said, her tone almost mocking. You think you're the first ones to feel silenced? The first ones to fight against power? You're not. You're just louder, and sometimes loud doesn't mean right. The words cut, but and didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in, closer to Whoopi, her voice dropping low, intense, as if meant only for her, but amplified for the world. Maybe we are louder, but maybe that's exactly what's needed. Because too many whispers got lost in the noise of comfort. Too many truths went unheard because they were polite. I don't want polite, Whoopi. I want change. And if that makes me loud, then I'll be loud until the walls shake. The crowd went wild. So wild that the producer's frantic hand signals were visible from the side of the stage, begging the audience to calm down for the sake of the broadcast. But it was no use. The eruption was unstoppable. Joy Behar's eyes darted nervously between the two women. Ladies, she tried, half joking, half serious. We're going to need a referee at this rate. The laughter from the audience was short, nervous, a momentary gasp of relief before the weight of the tension snapped them back to silence. And Hathaway straightened her shoulders, her voice steady but burning. You call it arrogance. I call it urgency. And I think the audience agrees with me. She gestured slightly toward the clapping, cheering crowd, whose energy swelled again at her words. Whoopi's lips curled into a sharp smile, not one of warmth, but of challenge. Don't mistake applause for truth, she warned. Audiences love a performance. But when the cameras go off, when the spotlight dims, reality is much colder. You'll find that out someday. Anne's response was immediate, her eyes locking on Whoopi's. And when that day comes, I'll face it knowing I didn't back down when it mattered. I'd rather fall on my feet fighting than live forever on my knees. The studio exploded. Applause shook the rafters, people leapt to their feet. The sound of whistles and cheers filled the room like a tidal wave. For the first time, it felt less like a talk show and more like a courtroom, with Anne Hathaway standing as both witness and prosecutor, while the audience roared in agreement like a jury delivering its verdict. Whoopi's expression hardened, but her eyes betrayed something, frustration, maybe even respect, buried deep beneath the surface. She leaned back, folding her arms across her chest, silent for the first time in minutes. The silence from her was almost louder than her words. Sunny Hostin finally spoke, her voice breaking the tension. What we're witnessing here, it's not just a debate. It's two truths colliding. Anne's right, there's more to be done. And Whoopi's right, it's a long, painful process. Maybe the point isn't who's louder, but how we bridge the gap. The audience clapped, though less frantically, grateful for the olive branch, the attempt to cool the fire. But the fire was still burning. And glanced at Sunny, then back at Whoopi. Bridging the gap is important, but not if it means silencing the ones screaming from the bottom of it. The room fell silent again. Even Sunny had no words to follow that. It was Whoopi who finally leaned forward, her voice softer this time, but sharper than ever. You think you've shut me down, Anne, but time will shut you down. That's the way this business works. It chews you up, spits you out, and moves on. And when that happens, when the audience isn't clapping anymore, let's see how loud you are then. It was a dagger, a final, stinging blow meant to slice deep. But Anne Hathaway didn't flinch. She smiled, calm, unshaken, almost defiant. Then let them see me fall, she said, her voice strong, resonant. Because even in falling, I'll know I stood taller than the silence that came before me. The audience was on their feet again, this time, nearly the entire studio. The sound was deafening, echoing off every wall, drowning out the producers, the hosts, even Whoopi's stoic silence. The clash had reached its crescendo. The duel between Hollywood's past and present, tradition and transformation, silence and voice, had erupted into something no one in that room would ever forget. And as the cameras lingered on the two women, Whoopi, unyielding but visibly shaken, and Anne radiant with defiance, the world outside the studio was already stirring, already preparing to take sides. Because this wasn't the end. It was the breaking point. And what came after would shake far beyond the walls of that stage. The moment the cameras cut to commercial, the studio was still vibrating from the eruption. Audience members remained on their feet, clapping and shouting as producers scrambled to regain control. Some tried to quiet the crowd, but the energy had already spilled past the walls of the set. It was raw, unstoppable. And Hathaway sat still, calm, her breathing steady despite the storm she had just unleashed. Whoopi Goldberg leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable, but her silence was heavy, almost louder than words. Between them lay an invisible line, drawn and deepened in front of millions of eyes. Backstage, assistants whispered frantically into headsets. Executives huddled in corners, weighing the fallout. No one had expected the segment to explode like this. They had booked Anne Hathaway for ratings, yes, for charm and Hollywood glamour. But what they got was a clash that would ripple far beyond a morning talk show. As the broadcast resumed, the panel attempted to return to safer ground. Sarah Haynes introduced the next topic with a strained smile, her voice quivering as she shifted the discussion to a lighter story. Joy Behar cracked a joke about politics, desperate to reset the tone. But it was too late. The atmosphere couldn't be undone. Every person in that room knew they had witnessed something seismic, something historic. The audience still buzzed, whispering, exchanging wide-eyed glances, some with phones already in hand, typing furiously, capturing every detail before the world demanded to know what had just happened. By the time Anne left the stage, escorted by staff, the internet was already awake. Clips of the exchange were uploaded within minutes, shaky phone footage, screen recordings, captions blazing. And Hathaway shuts down Whoopi Goldberg live. On Twitter, the hashtags trended instantly. Hashtag Anne versus Whoopi, hashtag The View Showdown, hashtag Anne Hathaway Unfiltered. One clip, showing Anne's fiery declaration. I'd rather fall on my feet fighting than live forever on my knees. Amassed millions of views within hours. It was replayed, remixed, turned into GIFs, and splashed across timelines with captions ranging from Queen Energy to This is how you end an argument. But the reactions weren't one-sided. Supporters of Whoopi rallied, pointing to her decades-long career, her trailblazing history, her authority earned through battles and couldn't begin to imagine. Respect your elders, one tweet read. Whoopi paved the way for you. Others argued and was out of line, disrespectful, arrogant in thinking she could confront a titan on her own turf. Meanwhile, think pieces began to emerge. News outlets ran with headlines. Anne Hathaway takes on Whoopi Goldberg in explosive on-air clash. The View erupts. Generations collide in heated debate. Hollywood's silence questioned as Anne Hathaway speaks out. On talk radio, callers lit up the lines, some praising and as a fearless truth-teller, others defending Whoopi as the voice of wisdom trying to remind a younger star of reality. By evening, late-night hosts were already weaving the confrontation into their monologues. One comedian quipped, "Forget Batman versus Superman, and Hathaway versus Whoopi Goldberg is the real clash of titans." The joke drew laughs, but beneath the humor lay the undeniable truth. The world had seen a battle of voices that cut deeper than entertainment. Anne's representatives released no statement. She remained silent, allowing the footage to speak for itself. Whoopi, on the other hand, addressed it briefly the next day on The View. "Look," she said, her tone weary but firm. "Anne and I had a passionate discussion. We don't always agree, but that's life. That's the point of this table. We hash things out. It was an attempt at closure, but it didn't erase what had happened." The clash had taken on a life of its own. In Hollywood circles, whispers spread. Some called her fearless. Others labeled her reckless. Industry insiders debated whether she had jeopardized future opportunities or solidified her role as a voice of her generation. Whoopi's peers, meanwhile, largely rallied around her, praising her resilience, her refusal to be rattled even as the crowd turned. The debate spilled beyond entertainment. Social activists praised and for refusing to stay quiet, for confronting systemic issues head-on. Others criticized her, claiming she had simplified a complex struggle into sound bites. The clash became more than a TV moment. It became a mirror, reflecting the fractures between generations, between approaches, between silence and voice. And through it all, one thing remained undeniable. Everyone was talking about it. In living rooms, coffee shops, offices, across dinner tables and subway rides, the question buzzed. Who was right? Anne or Whoopi? Some said Whoopi had the wisdom of time. Others swore and had the fire of truth. The world was divided but united in one thing. They couldn't look away. And perhaps that was the real aftermath. Not who won, but how much it mattered. As for Anne Hathaway, when asked days later during a red carpet interview if she regretted the confrontation, she smiled calmly, the same way she had on that stage, and said only, "No, some things are worth saying, no matter the cost." The internet lit up again. And so the legacy of that moment lived on, not just as a clash between two icons, but as a spark in a larger fire, a reminder that truth, spoken boldly, always leaves ripples. Now the question is for you. What do you think? Did Anne Hathaway strike a blow for truth? Or did Whoopi Goldberg remind her of a reality she'll one day come to understand? Whose side are you on in this unforgettable showdown? Tell us in the comments below. We want to hear your voice in this conversation. And if you were captivated by this clash, make sure to subscribe to Prime Narrator for more explosive, dramatic stories from the world of Hollywood and beyond. Hit the like button, share this video with a friend, and join us for the next confrontation that leaves the world stunned. Because as this moment proved, sometimes the most powerful battles aren't fought in movies. They're fought live, unfiltered, and unforgettable.